another college football Saturday here in the fall. And wow, we already have, I wouldn't say major upset, but an upset certainly here early on in the day as the Pitt Panthers fall to the North Carolina State Wolfpack 30-29. And that's just one part of this week's post-game show, as we're going to do something a little different with West Virginia and Pitt both kicking off at the same time. WVU not holding up their end of the bargain, though, as they don't conclude the game at the same time, but maybe they will have better luck. I'm their host, Mike Asti, here for the Pittsburgh Sports Live, Pittsburgh Postgame edition of College Football Saturday here throughout the Now Network. So we're going to have Pittsburgh Sports Now and WV Sports Now both represented, as we're going to discuss Pitt's loss to North Carolina State and West Virginia's overtime appearance here against Baylor. It looks like WVU's actual victory against the Baylor Bears. Tom Bragg is going to join us, from one of our writers from WV Sports Now, to discuss that game. And I have a pinch hitter, my colleague and friend, KDKA's own producer with KDKA, James Santelli, who will fill in for Mike Vukovican, as he has that Pitt polo on, resident Pitt fan as well, to discuss Pitt's surprising loss to North Carolina State. And I would definitely say Pitt being a ranked team, and based on what we've not yet seen from other games concluding and what maybe could even happen later on the night, this right now is the upset of the day. And James, obviously it's an upset. Now, Pitt being 24th in the country, and the way they had been playing to this point, being 3-0, something that Narduzzi had not had happen to him during the Narduzzi era. This was a Pitt team that thought 5-0 was realistic going to that Miami game, even how they played against Louisville in comparison to how Miami did, that it was realistic for Pitt to run through this schedule before maybe they would get to Notre Dame. That's obviously not what happens now. And this game was a roller coaster ride off of a big play from Madison early on. North Carolina State had a lead, Pitt came back, and then it continuously was that topsy-turvy game that allowed the Wolfpack to eventually get the late game win. What's your initial takeaway right now in terms of this loss and how it does kind of change what you thought could have been a very special year for the Pitt Panthers?
Well, it kind of shows Pitt as a team and the players that they're really not as hot as they thought they were coming into this week. You know, once the Big Ten and the Pac-12, although really just Oregon, were added into the rankings, that was what pushed Pitt down. And a lot of Pitt players took a lot of umbrage with that. They were like, hey, we were already ranked. We beat another ranked team and we moved down. What's going on with that? And really, they should have known that this was not a team that would have been ranked heading into the Louisville game if it weren't for the lack of Big Ten and Pac-12 teams. So we'll start from that. But you're right, it is still an upset, and it's an upset that Pitt created themselves. I mean, if it hadn't been for all of the penalties that they had racked up in the first half, and to a lesser extent in the second half, I need to double check how many there were, but something close to 20 penalties on the Pitt side. That's something that they created themselves. They made their own mistakes. They made their own bed. They weren't able to pull away from NC State when they finally started to get it together, you know, late in the third and into the fourth quarter. Offense was really clicking. Kenny Pickett was finding his guys downfield. And even though they got it together and limited NC State on offense in the second half, because of all the mistakes early on, they weren't able to pull away. They left the door open for NC State, and that's how you got the upset.
Yeah, James Santelli here, Mike Asti on Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. We're currently wrapping up Pitt's loss to North Carolina State. Definitely an upset loss that very likely is moving Pitt out of the top 25 rankings. Tom Bragg from WV Sports Now will join us in a bit when that game wraps up. And take my words away, it looks like Baylor has tied that again. So they have ruined this entire plan of the day that we had all mapped out and thought I was going to be able to manipulate the college football world that had our games start off and kick off at the same time. Nonetheless, we'll see when Tom can join us here. But yeah, I think you make a good point that this definitely feels like a game that Pitt is, and this has kind of been Pitt the last few years for sure, that Pitt is going to turn a year that still could be a good one into a year that maybe will be even worse than that, and in a year that initially could have been a really special season. And wouldn't shock me if Pitt would still be able to beat Miami, but then even after that win and Pitt gets back in the rankings, I'm sure Pitt fans are going to have in their head, well, we're 23rd after beating Miami, and now we're 5-1. But boy, if we would have beat North Carolina State, it could have been something special, and that's not the case again. Is it just about the penalties? Did you notice anything maybe different from the defense? Because I talked with Mike Vukovican, obviously our head honcho at Pittsburgh Sports now, the last few weeks. And Pitt's defense was really hyped coming into the year. And don't get me wrong, Pitt's defense was playing really well to this point most of the season. But there were a few different spots in every one of those games where it almost seemed like they just went to sleep. I don't know what happened there. There's a few different plays you could pick out. But nobody was going to, because it was one of the better defensive performances so far in the year. You see a little bit more of those in this game, and it does compound with mistakes for a veteran bunch with the hype, knowing how good this Pitt team could overall be. It does feel like the defense kind of let this team down a little bit, and I don't know if they let the hype get to them or what happened here, but did you see any differences from the Pitt defense in comparison to those first three games? Granted, against Austin Peay, Syracuse, and teams that weren't that great in the college football landscape, but neither's really North Carolina State.
Well, it's certainly a letdown in the sense that this was probably Pitt's best offensive game when you consider the opponent. You know, Austin Peay, a not very good Division I FCS team aside. It was a strong offensive game. Kenny Pickett had the most yards he has had in his Pitt career. You know, if it weren't for a few drops by his receivers, he could have been approaching 500 yards today. So the fact that you had that and the defense wasn't able to do enough to get the victory, I think that speaks not only to the weaknesses they have, but also how NC State took advantage of them. The real Achilles heel of this Pitt defense is kind of the cornerbacks and going along the sidelines with those corners. And
Right.
NC State was able to pick that apart with one of their strengths, which is having those taller, bigger receivers that were able to both make some catches along the sideline, extend drives, but also, you know, position themselves in a way, and they used enough deep balls to get enough holds, defensive holds, pass interference calls that allowed them to extend, keep going, and get a couple of touchdowns there. And you know what? That's part of the passing game. You can criticize the officials in this game for some of the calls, and they certainly weren't perfect. I can speak specifically to that one roughing the passer call that allowed a drive to extend for NC State. But the Wolfpack took advantage. They knew that they were not going to be able to beat Pitt going up the middle, up against that front seven, and with DeMar Hamlin and Paris Ford there for Pitt. That's the real strength of this defense. So you go along the sidelines, you try to make those plays, you get the calls, you get a whole lot of calls as it turned out today, and that was enough. And when the rubber really needed to hit the road for Pitt and that last drive, and they just needed to keep NC State out of the end zone with a little over a minute to play, they went prevent and couldn't actually prevent NC State from getting into the end zone. They let the 15 yards here, 15 yards there keep going down. You got another penalty, and then lo and behold, Wolfpack are in the end zone. So it speaks to what this Pitt defense is and isn't. It's still one of the strongest defenses up the middle, those nine guys that you've got up there. Right. But when it comes to cornerbacks and when it comes to defending a team that really has those bigger, stronger receivers, they didn't have it today.
Yeah, and I also do feel it looks like for Pitt here offensively, they had that big play to Addison early on. Kenny Pickett, 400 plus yards, 411 yards.
And then they lost Addison in the second half. So that,
right.
That
I was going to bring up that Addison not being around. Do you think that played into this game as well? Because obviously Kenny Pickett has tons of yards, 411 yards, a touchdown. but Addison not being there, it certainly changes the offense. I mean, he finishes with only 77 yards, 75 of them were from that opening play of the day for Pitt. So it made the Pitt's offense not as dynamic. You compound the mistakes, you go towards the defense. We do see here in the chat, Andy N, are we really surprised? Typical Pitt 500 team as usual. I guess I'll ask this. This obviously is a loss, obviously a bad loss for Pitt. This is a game that I'm sure when most Pitt fans, I'm sure Narduzzi, when they're mapping out the schedule, you want to win every game, but I'm sure they were thinking, well, this is a game we have to win. This is a game we're going to win to make this a special year. You can look at Notre Dame and maybe Clemson and say, okay, if we lose those, we're not going to lose any sleep tonight. But that maybe could be the case for North Carolina State. But do you feel like this is just another Pitt team? This is just going to end up being another average year, that they're going to putter away another game that they also should win? Are you concerned about Boston College as well? I will say for me, there still seems to be a difference in Kenny Pickett and this team that, unlike past years, for maybe a glass half full take, they should be better equipped to get over a game like this. But clearly Pitt fans are feeling like this is just same old story.
Well, hey, I'm a Pitt fan too, and I know this feeling well. A game that we had in the bag that we should have won to be able to go to 4-0, which so rarely happens for Pitt starting out the season. And yeah, I get that, particularly because they had the advantage of starting the first 4 games of the season all at home. And you're not going to get that going into the last half of the season, where you got to do a lot more traveling, particularly down to Miami in a couple of weeks' time. This was what you needed to take advantage of, and they didn't do it. But at the same time, is it the exact same Pitt? Not really. It's, despite the good work of Kenny Pickett today, still not a very good offense generally. You have the weapons, you have, guys when they're making catches, particularly the one that Taysir Mack made over the middle, he got flipped into a somersault and still held onto the football. You have the ability there, but it hasn't actually come into play. I saw a stat earlier, one of the lowest touchdowns per play ratios, or points per play, however you want to measure it, in the country. They don't have really quick strike ability. If they're going to score, it's coming over long drives. And we saw today when they had multiple chances to pound it into the end zone with 1st and goal at the 1, they couldn't do it. Right. And they kind of got a good call on the last touchdown by Kenny Pickett. The referees were swallowing their whistles, not blowing the play dead, and he was still able to just barely get it in on a quarterback sneak. Those are the sort of things that you need to work on. That's not typical Pitt. Typical Pitt team has the big running backs to be able to convert on.
I was going to get there,
goal to go situations, exactly. And this is a far better defense than we've had from Pitt teams in the past. Like, this is where the Narduzzi effect is finally coming into play, and you've got a great defense. So typical Pitt team, no, not really. Typical Pitt feeling? Oh yeah. We've had these many a time, and we might see it again, say in a couple weeks' time, Pitt does get the upset of Miami, and then maybe, comes back the next week, upsets Notre Dame, and then loses to a Florida State team that doesn't look very good this year. Like, these are things that could happen when you are a Pitt fan.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the entire chat activity, is just same old Pitt. But as you have articulated, it is not really the same old Pitt, but a different Pitt provided a very similar result, which does not gain much favor with fans, of course, here. James Santelli from KDKA, Mike Asti here with the Pittsburgh Sports Live postgame show, our college football wrap for the day. Pitt and WVU both kicking off at the same time, so we're doing kind of one show here for Pittsburgh Sports Now and also WV Sports Now. Now, before we bring Tom aboard here, I see he's waiting around because West Virginia did get the victory. They do end up winning in double overtime against Baylor, so the Mountaineers now 2-1 on the season, and that was a big win for WVU to kind of keep their season respectable as well. James, you mentioned the running game for Pitt, and Mike Vakovican has been all over this at Pittsburgh Sports Now most of the season. We talked about in every single post-game show that Pitt and the national broadcast team last week even brought this up, that Pitt needs to stabilize somebody as the featured back. They really have not. There hasn't even really been such an effort. I don't know if maybe they don't feel like somebody can be that guy. Obviously, the Davis brothers are options. Vincent Davis getting 40 yards again today, but Kenny Pickett being basically your best runner in terms of the box score today, not normally a recipe for success for the Pitt Panthers. Is the fact that Pitt has not established the running game and then maybe even not being able to work in the tight ends as much as maybe some Pitt fans thought was going to happen this year, are those two things holding back the offense? Is that what needs to correct? Do you need a legit running game to get those wins later on in the season as this schedule beefs up now, especially now already with a loss?
Oh, there's no question about it. That was a big part of the fact that Pitt couldn't make up for their mistakes early on in the game. The fact that you were getting the ball back down to this not as good NC State team and going 3 and out and giving the ball right back to them. Like, that is not what Pat Narduzzi wanted to see. And you can't blame it entirely on Mark Whipple as the offensive coordinator. Yeah, there was some crappy play calling in the first half. There were some bad calls when you had goal to go situations. But you know what? Bad play calls can be overcome by good talent, especially in the running game. And if you've got guys on the offensive line that can get a push, that can overcome bad play calling in the red zone. It did not today. It didn't happen. Kenny Pickett was able to paper over some of that today by punching it in on quarterback sneak and making some very good throws to be able to kind of pick apart the zone at times for NC State and give Pitt the opportunity to come back in the second half. But you wouldn't have had to make a comeback if in the first place you actually had a running game in the first half that could keep pace with NC State even when you were making mistakes. So yeah, that's going to be a whole lot of trouble going into Miami, facing off against Notre Dame. When you have good defenses that that Kenny Pickett won't be able to pick apart and be able to make downfield throws. If you can't get anything going offensively and you're relying entirely on the defensive side, that's going to be trouble even for a team with as good a defense as Pitt has.
I think the Miami game is really one to circle. Obviously, Boston called before, and nothing is guaranteed based on what we saw today with the Pitt Panthers. But that Miami game seemed like a favorable matchup for Pitt's defense. It seemed like the way Miami, they've been winning, but they kind of been struggling. They haven't been impressing. What Pitt did to Louisville in comparison to how Miami played Louisville, that seemed to be a favorable matchup for the Panthers. But now, especially off of kind of what you're saying to piggyback off of that, if Pitt gets down in that game, they don't have a running game really. They can't establish that. It becomes really the Kenny Pickett show. While he's more a veteran, while clearly he can do more as an athlete now than he could have done a year ago, Miami is a defense that they love throwing that gold chain around. I mean, they basically just want to create turnovers and then not worry about actually playing defense otherwise. The whole plan is to create turnovers and then hope, if they allow any yards, you're going to score against them, but they want turnovers. That's pretty much their game plan. That's what they practice for. That could be disaster.
And by the way, that's not altogether different from what Pitt's defense had looked like.
I guess so, yeah.
Go back to last week. Yeah, you had a ton of sacks, but you also had a lot of takeaways and a lot of slamming of the footballs into the basket there along the sideline. That is what saved Pitt last week. If it hadn't been for that, you would have totaled up all these sacks and still lost to Louisville and still ended up 2-2 to start the season. And you know what? Maybe for whatever reason, Pitt fans would have felt better about that they would have just thought, oh, well, it's just not, the team that we were hoping it could be if we had everybody defensively this year. But, you raise expectations a little bit and then Pitt cuts them down. It's just the way that it happens. But it's a similarly strong defenses, similarly talented defenses. And, in most weeks, if Pitt hadn't made as many mistakes, collected as many fouls, and kind of had bad calls against them, it would have been another week that Pitt's defense papered over the problems and still won the game. It didn't happen this week. They couldn't overcome that.
One thing I want to get to, and kind of where you're going a little bit before we bring Tom on here again. James Santelli, Mike Asti here, Tom Bragg to join us in a minute here. Pitt losers today, now 3-1 on the year, and maybe the Pittsburgh sports god. It was the first time in a long time both Pitt and the Steelers were 3-0, and the 4-0 for both those two teams would have been something else. Very possible coming into the weekend. Maybe before Wednesday. Obviously, the Steelers not playing at all because of positive tests around the Tennessee Titans with COVID-19. Pitt now losing. So the glory of what could have been this weekend of those two teams here in the city both being 4-0 as the weekend closes, not the case at all, with one already now having lost in the Panthers and the Steelers having to wait a whole week or so to be a chance at 4-0. But when you look at a team that loses games they otherwise should win, that does not allow a special year to happen because of those upsets, that has a veteran team with hype but still doesn't get it done, now has weapons emerging, doesn't get it done, and you see a lot of penalties and mistakes and things like that. For you as a Pitt fan, and this is different than what the program will do, of course, but you as a Pitt fan, do you at all think of this has to point to Narduzzi at some point, that maybe he's on the hook for you in terms of you wanting him to be the Pitt head coach? Obviously, the start of this year is better than what he's had in recent memory, but you have to include that's Austin Peay. That's one of the worst Syracuse teams in a long time. So does this cause Narduzzi to lose favor with the way they're losing? Because that does kind of point to coaching with what you're describing.
I get where you're coming from, but it doesn't for me, really.
I wasn't going to go there until the way you were speaking, because that does kind of analyze towards coaching.
Yeah, and you're right. In some ways, it's a matter of discipline. They did not play disciplined football on the defensive side today. But is that enough to be losing favor with him as a head coach? Probably not. And I may be more apologetic for Narduzzi than most Pitt fans would be.
Okay.
I don't think I have the same kind of delusions of grandeur that some Pitt fans might have. I think that's part of it. I think that the Narduzzi era has been a general success, and the defense that he has built, mistakes and penalties and discipline notwithstanding, are a testament to the job that he has done building this.
And recruiting wise, that's been a plus, and you're now seeing that come to fruition now.
Yeah. So do I think it bodes well or bodes poorly for him going forward? Not really. We're still only a month into a very strange season. You still have your toughest opponents left on the horizon. Right. Let's see how all that plays out. So no, I'm not going to go there at this point. It was crappy today. It does not reflect well on him today. Right. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't do much for me there.
James, you're able to be a Pittsburgh sports fan that can look beyond just today. I'm very, very proud of you and happy to hear it, because that is not the norm here. Again, Mike Asti, James Santelli here on Pittsburgh.
That's the kind of perspective I bring to the table.
Yeah, I'm happy to have it on Pittsburgh Sports Live, wrapping up Pitt's surprising upset so far. Certainly the upset today in college football, lost to North Carolina State, bumping Pitt out of the rankings, their first loss of the year. Pitt now 3-1 on the season. And you'll hear and see all of that over there at Pittsburgh Sports Now. We're going to keep James aboard, but also now add in Tom Bragg, who is one of our writers over at WV Sports Now. And as we connect Tom, I do want to now move aboard to the West Virginia game, because in all reality, and there's a little bit less on the overall college football map today than in some weeks, this game ended up being one of the games of the day to this point. Certainly a noon kickoff, double overtime, two kind of middle-of-the-road conference teams with West Virginia and Baylor. WVU ending up with a 27-21 victory in double overtime in a game that, talk about a roller coaster ride, and neither team wanting to seal it. It almost had, James, a little bit of a Pitt flavor in that game, because I will tell you, both teams kind of flirted with disaster as well as success throughout that game, and it seemed like a game that neither wanted to fully grab. Baylor missing tons of field goals, Charlie Brewer going in and out of the game, and he would be the star. Jarrett Doege looking good, but then the offense not really able to come alive for the Mountaineers. and able to do enough, especially a goal line stand there towards the end with West Virginia's defense, despite all the controversy in the offseason, able to have that big stand that without it, this game would have been a loss prior to overtime, and then the Mountaineers able to emerge. Tom, what are your takeaways from West Virginia's double overtime win over Baylor? To be fair to the Mountaineers, this was a WVU team coming off of a loss last week to Oklahoma State, so they were not riding high. This was a team they needed to beat in Baylor, with the schedule getting even tougher as the season goes on, but certainly a team in Baylor that has been the sexy pick for a lot of people coming into the year. When I did the preview show with a writer down there for Dave Campbell's Texas Football, which is a major publication down there in Texas, he kind of talked about there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of fanfare. We mentioned it last week on the postgame show around Baylor, and that Baylor team maybe could make some quiet noise if Oklahoma and Texas kept struggling, like we even see today from the Longhorns. But Baylor loses. WVU does get the win. So, Tom, what do you make of this victory for the Mountaineers as they trek through a season now back above 500?
Baylor and West Virginia have a weird way of just bringing out the worst in each other. Like, it's a terrible game. Ever since that crazy shootout they had, I think the first Big 12 game WVU ever played was at 70-63 in Morgantown. Terrible games ever since then.
That was really entertaining. They keep bringing that up even nationally going into this week, and I'm like, guys, that's not even in the consciousness of anybody now. But yes, it was amazing.
Yeah, this one, it was a slog to watch. I know you look at the final score and see, oh, double overtime, that must have been fun. No, it was not a fun game to watch. But I will say that if you're going to take a silver lining out of this for WVU, you get the win. It's a conference win. That's something you needed. Get a little bit of momentum going before you get into this stretch of teams that you really should be able to beat and hang with. You've got Kansas and Kansas State and Texas Tech coming up. West Virginia's defense looked really, really good today. Not just good against Baylor. Like, that's a team, that's a unit rather, that looks like it can play with anybody in the Big 12. Not too concerned about West Virginia's defense right now. You mentioned, of course, there was offseason controversy. I think we're seeing that, the previous defensive coordinator had a hand in making these guys pretty good, but these guys can play a little bit. I think the Jimmies and Joes and not the X's and O's in this case. Other thing I really liked today, I thought Letty Brown looked really good. He's established himself as the man as West Virginia's running back. One of the better running backs in the league, probably. I know the offense struggled at times to finish drives and score points, and that's something we've talked about for a couple weeks here on the show, Mike. But as far as the running back, the running game in general, leaps and bounds ahead of where it was certainly this time last year.
Yeah, and I do want to spend a moment on the defense, because I honestly feel, and obviously just speaking with James, Pitt's defense getting tons of credit coming into the season, tons of hype, and deservingly so, except for maybe today for the Panthers. WVU's defense, the numbers pointed one way last year. The performance from who I've talked with in terms of W media and even coaches maybe pointed the other way. But Vic Koenig's departure, a lot around the program kind of were freaking out a little bit, maybe even more so behind closed doors than publicly, just for the fact that it puts a lot more on Neil Brown early in his tenure, and it takes continuity away from a coach that is a veteran coach that many thought Vic Koenig did a great job coaching up that defense last year under the circumstances, even though it was a poor season for the Mountaineers overall. You come into this year, though, he's not there. They move on from the controversy. Players involved in that, not even there. So this is almost kind of a clean slate overall. And this defense, I don't feel they actually have got credit for how well they played to this point. And it really came to light in this game, as they really did save the day towards the end of this game. Has this defense been better than maybe you even thought? And what do you think is triggering this defense to play so well outside of just the cliche sports media? Oh, they've galvanized together in the heat of controversy that I'm sure somebody's going to say nationally. But what is really going on here with this West Virginia defense?
I think they're playing up to their level of expectations that they have for themselves. I think you allow Eastern Kentucky just to score points, period. That's a bad week for your defense. It doesn't matter who you are. Right. And last week they were in some bad situations. West Virginia wasn't finishing drives. We talked about that. They were settling for field goals instead of touchdowns, or just not getting anything out of drives that looked like they should produce points. So they were in bad situations last week. What you saw today, I mean, look at who the stars were. The Stills brothers up front. Everybody knows about those guys coming in. That's, as advertised. Josh Chandler, probably the best linebacker on the team coming into the season, and Tony Fields, the graduate transfer from Arizona that came in with a lot of hype. Those guys, stars today. Tyke Smith with the big interception in overtime. That guy was a freshman All-American. So it's the guys that West Virginia is expecting to be good. That's who they're leaning on, and they're coming through so far. So I don't think it's a surprise or a case of this team galvanizing or rallying around anything. I think they're just playing up to their own level of expectations for themselves right now.
Sure. I love the term galvanize, though. Galvanize and asinine are two terms I have to get on the broadcast. So Pitt was asinine so far today, and WVU's defense galvanized, I guess, might be the summary for the show here. James Santelli repping us as a pinch hitter for Pittsburgh Sports Now to recap Pitt's surprising and upset loss to North Carolina State, a conference loss for the Panthers, and Tom Bragg, one of our main guys over there, WV Sports Now, covering the Mountaineers' double overtime victory over the Baylor Bears. I'm, of course, Mike Asti here on Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Now, Tom, you mentioned Lady Brown, who, again, he's almost been running angry. It almost appears he's been running mad this year. I've seen that a lot on Twitter throughout the season, that he almost wants to prove what happened last year at the running game is not really indicative of the running game, and they're going to turn that around this year. What have you thought of the running game and how that's played into Jarrett Doege and this overall offense? Because Austin Kendall, clearly not as good, not as dynamic, but he also didn't get a lot around him off with the offensive line and the running game. And Jarrett Doege getting a lot of help. And I don't know if that's getting enough love either, that the running game was allowing the passing game to be opened up. But also, Tom, this offense took a while to open up today. So we've seen spurts from the offense this season. We've seen Doege
I would argue that it never opened up today.
Yeah, you could argue that. But we've seen spurts from Jarrett Doege this season to prove that he maybe is the guy that should be there. We've seen Lady Brown. We've seen success from individuals, Winston Wright last week that we talked about. But I guess that's even maybe a better thought. This offense has shown flashes of what it could be, but has yet really been able to put a full game together or really even a half together. So why do you think that is? If there's an emergence of individuals, why collectively have we not seen points on the board?
Oh, it's hard to put your finger on any one reason, Mike. Jarrett Doege has not been great. He's been good, but he hasn't been great. And you see mistakes. There were turnovers today that really were avoidable. It wasn't a situation where, you kind of throw your hands up like, it's football. It happens sometimes. No, it wasn't the case with his turnovers today.
Okay.
They throw 42 passes. He completes 30 of them, only for 211 yards, though. They're not getting the ball down the field when they try to throw the ball. So you can get chunk plays of 3 and 4 yards at a clip running the ball. Mm-hmm. But if that doesn't work on one play, now you're behind the sticks and they're not moving the ball down the field through the air. And I think that shows up in a game that was 14-14 going into overtime and really was lucky to be that, as bad as these two teams were at offense today. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, West Virginia's defense had a lot to do with that, but Baylor was out of sync all day long. It seemed like on offense. Charlie Brewer didn't look great.
No.
Looked a little dinged up even. I know he came out at one point late in the game. They brought in kind of the bulldozer quarterback option. Yeah. Not sure if that was because they just wanted to run with that guy or if something was going on with Charlie because he took a hit before there. But yeah, not a great look for the Big 12 overall, I think. These are two teams that were kind of in the middle that you think maybe one of them can make a run,
I would think that most people probably would have picked Baylor over the Mountaineers this year.
Sure. But I think, of that group of teams in the middle of the Big 12 that you say, who can emerge from that group and be in that, quote unquote, top tier teams. And it looks like neither of these teams are capable of doing that, but it doesn't look like anybody in the Big 12 is capable of doing that right now. Right. TCU has not looked good so far. They go out and beat Texas today. You had Texas Tech that looked terrible against one of the worst 1AA teams in the country. They turn around and almost beat Texas in overtime last week. Kansas State is not that good, and they just own Oklahoma. You don't know what's going on. And you got Oklahoma at Iowa State later today, and if you follow college football at all, you know that weird things happen in Ames, Iowa, particularly when a very good team comes to town. So just expect chaos in that. It's entertaining. I think it's going to rate well with the dummies on Twitter like me that enjoy bad football sometimes.
Who are you calling dummies? Are you calling James and I dummies?
I said me specifically.
Okay.
I think you guys are telling on yourselves there, or at least Mike's telling on.
I watch a lot of Pitt, so I guess I do enjoy bad football.
Oh, man. You and me both, buddy.
Yeah, I think it's all the way around.
Lifelong fan of the Washington football team here. So I've seen lots of bad football.
Gotcha.
But getting back to the Big 12 though,
Yeah.
it just you can't help but feel like the other shoe is waiting to drop with the Big 10 and the Pac-12 coming back, and the Big 12 just looking bad in the meantime.
And we are going to get there because Texas, who flirted with disaster last week, decides to actually accomplish disaster here today.
They're
Up
back.
losing. Yeah, so the whole conversation that I really feel like is a national push, and I guess I get it because money-wise, it would be better if this could actually ever happen. But as much as people yell out, "We're back," Texas just never is. And they win last week over Texas Tech in that really bizarre shootout for two offenses that you didn't think were going to do that. They score again today, but lose to TCU, another maybe middle of the road team in the Big 12 that now I guess is there based on a victory 33-31 over Texas. And this moves Texas out of the top 10 to now, who knows? And this certainly puts, we'll get to again here in a moment, this puts the Big 12, that loss really in jeopardy, because after Oklahoma's loss, Texas appeared then in the driver's seat of being that number 4, will give the Big 12 a playoff team kind of spot, especially if they could have beat Oklahoma in the Red River Shootout. With this loss now, we're probably going to be seeing a situation where those Big 10, those Pac-12 teams, if they can get hot, they certainly can bump out the Big 12 all together. But Tom, what I do want to touch on here, again, the Mountaineers getting a double overtime victory, Pitt losing North Carolina State. James Santelli, Tom Bragg here, Mike Asti on Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live for Pittsburgh Sports Now, and of course WV Sports Now. Is the Mountaineers here moving forward? Does this change anything from what you've seen here in this game, kind of playing it for the rest of the schedule? You mentioned the next 2 weeks do get, I guess, easier in terms of games that were winnable games, we'll call them. Then the schedule certainly does get harder. It's impossible, though, to gauge the Big 12 this year based on what we've already seen. They could probably win any game. They also probably could lose any of these games remaining on the season. Unlike Narduzzi in the conversation with James, even though they're kind of losing similarly with a lot of penalties and mistakes, Neil Brown, they're only on his second season. A lot of media I spoke to really say this is year 1 because the program didn't even really count last year, knowing the circumstances. So obviously his job is not in jeopardy, but still, what are now your expectations around this Mountaineer team? They get over 500. They get a win over Baylor. But as you said, the score might not be indicative of how this game actually unfolded. And Charlie Brewer didn't play to snuff. Baylor misses all those field goals that could have secured thing in regulation. Basically, speaking with Shayon Jayaraja in the preview show, who covers Baylor, of course, down there in Texas for Dave Campbell's Texas football, he basically was saying that if Baylor won, that is what had to happen. You had to see Charlie Brewer had success. You had to see the front line do well. Certain things he also mentioned for WVU. And while his analysis was astute, it didn't happen. And yet we still end up with this result. So does it change things moving forward, your expectations around the Mountaineers?
No, I kind of thought this was a coin flip game. Coming in, there were obviously certain things Baylor needed to do to be successful they weren't able to do today. There were certain things West Virginia needed to do to be able to get a win today. You don't necessarily check all of those boxes, but the important thing is you get the win. And I think in a season like this in the Big 12,
yeah,
that's really the important thing. Look, you're probably not going to be in the conversation for the college football playoff if you're
right.
anybody other than Texas or Oklahoma, realistically, coming out of the Big 12.
Right.
So you just want to put yourself in the best position possible, and you just got to win games to do that. It doesn't matter at that point if you win them by 2, if you win them by 20, if you win them in triple overtime, or if it's, a game that's over by halftime. And West Virginia was able to do what they needed to do to get the win today. Yeah, they do need to clean things up. They've got to get rid of the bad penalties. They've got to get rid of the silly mistakes like the botched punt return that I'm sure is going to be making the rounds on all of the not top 10s, where I believe it was Alex Singfield was back to fair catch a punt, and it was Bryce Ford Wheaton was trying to block his man. I don't think he was necessarily doing the wrong thing as far as his blocking assignment. He just had no idea where he was on the field and ran straight into the West Virginia player trying to receive the punt. So it's little things like that you got to clean up. And just even in telling that, it wasn't a complete loss on that. He was doing something right. You just got to get him to do it all right all the time. And that's where West Virginia has shot itself in the foot over and over again these last 2 weeks. Last week, you're on the road at Oklahoma State. It doesn't go your way. This week, you're at home. You get some things to go your way, and you're able to get the win. Things we talked about last week that I liked. West Virginia spreading the ball around. I know the passing game isn't moving the ball down the field, but you're trying to get a lot of guys involved. And I don't know if that's really good or bad because they haven't really been able to settle on a guy as the
we
guy.
Thought it was Winston Wright last week.
He caught 6 balls today, but he only for 22 yards. And I think that goes back to they're not stretching the field. So it's a mixed bag with this group right now. And I'm not sure that it changes the expectations at all, but I'm not sure that having expectations are really a good thing right now for this West Virginia team. You almost have to take it week by week. Because like I said, the Big 12 is going to change by the hour every Saturday, it seems like. So just worry about winning your game each week and then start worrying about the next week after it. I've been hanging out with coaches too much, man. That sounds like
Neil Brown, speaking of coaches, he actually said in his press conference there that we now have on WV Sports Now that some may call this game ugly. I call it gritty. That was the quote. So that is he's putting lipstick on a pig of this one. But again, he's rebuilding. It's a young team. He's not going to throw a team under the bus after a double overtime victory. But that's a nice quote there. I don't mind that one. Bringing James back aboard here. We see Texas go down. We know what happened with Oklahoma last week. We see the emergence now of the Big Ten about to play some football. The Pac-12 then decides to join the party. They kind of were the last holdout, and they're going to play play football as well. James, what do you think the conferences of the Big 12 and Pac-12 in terms of their chances of really getting in there for the playoff, getting in there with solid ranks? How are they impacted by seeing these early season upsets? Do they now have a better chance that if those teams, the normal giants of those conferences, even maybe some that weren't predicted to do so this year, can start out hot, would say a 2-0 Pac-12 or Big Ten team be given credence over a 6-1 team with a bad loss? How do you maybe think those rankings are going to work?
With the Pac-12, probably nobody except Oregon, maybe. I mean, if you get an Oregon team that really goes out there and impresses in a short slate, they could make an argument, but nobody else really strikes me as anybody that would really have a chance. I mean, USC might be the second best team in that conference, and that's not a very good team at all. So it's more of an opportunity for the Big Ten. It's more of an opportunity for a shortened slate for an Ohio State, a Penn State, maybe even Wisconsin, if they can, find a groove and run the table in a short schedule, they would absolutely have arguments to be included in the playoff. Maybe Michigan too, but Pac-12 wise, I don't see it.
Yeah, and Tom, I know you have to bounce here soon, and we're going to wrap things up here soon anyway. But just any thoughts in terms of what's going on overall in college football? And we did kind of allude to the Big 12 situation with all these upsets and the topsy-turvy ride, especially with the emergence of these other conferences getting in there. Does this really put the Big 12 in jeopardy of not really being included at all unless there's an expansion announced? And even then, maybe not?
Oh, I think if there's an expansion, they're absolutely in. But as it stands now, I think there's legitimate concern there. You look, whoever loses Texas, Oklahoma next week is going to have 2 losses. If the winner of that loses again, you've got your 2 marquee teams have 2 losses. It would take equally bad Big 10 and Pac-12 play over the course of the last month of the season. And let's not rule it out.
As James knows, the Pac-12 could certainly do this for everybody.
This not unprecedented. And I forget James Santelli, Pac-12 expert, as I forget. He,
right.
He has a degree from a Pac-12 team.
The source for all of my Southern California football news.
I Pac-12 PTSD is really what I have.
Because you can get James's age when he has that degree is not from the heyday of USC football, even though
I got a BS, but it's not a bachelor in science.
Right.
Anyway, so I think the Big 12 is not on red alert, but it's something that's in your head at this point now. If you're starting to look ahead and look at, well, how is this going to play out? Where are we going to line up? How are we going to get a team into the Final Four, into the playoff? And I think you might be onto something there mentioning the expansion of the playoff. If there's going to be a cheerleader for it at this point, it's got to be the Big 12, right?
You would think so. And I don't know if the money signs are going to start rolling in their heads that they've been hesitant to do this. But if they think themselves, we're not going to get Oklahoma unless we expand this.
Oh, buddy, this conference is based in Dallas. That money sign is constantly rolling. It doesn't.
Yeah, right. Or Texas as well.
Start up. It's going.
Yeah, right. So Texas as well involved there. It's an interesting day in college football. This is going to be, there's still certainly major games left in this day. There's still a lot left in this season, but the disputed rankings that have been over the years are really going to be disputed this season, because certainly there are going to be some teams that they do not want to leave out in the college football landscape that are only going to have a couple games in when some of these other teams, middle of the road teams, have a loss or so. And James, that's why this Pitt loss to NC State is really a killer, because Pitt had to go in undefeated once Ohio State and those teams start playing. And now already with a bad loss certainly hurts the Panthers on getting back to a ranking that I'm sure they undoubtedly are going to lose. Thanks to
one final point. They do get to
fingers.
be in a position that Pitt really likes to be in, which is possibly spoiling either Miami or Notre Dame, or at the very end, Clemson.
The super weapon. It's charging up, man.
Yeah.
Charge it, baby.
That is very possible, but at least for Tom and I, and at least for Mountaineer fans, since this is a rebuilding year, the Pitt can't ruin the year for the Mountaineers. They're not on the schedule either.
Not this time, boys.
Not this time. No, but Pitt certainly can play into that, hopefully expecting more than that, of course. We will see how this season goes. We will see maybe if we even do a quad little show here if need be when Penn State starts playing some football. We do have Nittany Sports now in existence as the Big Ten again. They are going to play. The Pac-12 will too. So the party is now in full effect around college football, and the upsets are galore, maybe even more than normal. The Pitt Panthers, one of them, they lose. They bump out of the rankings, losing to North Carolina State 30-29. Pitt now 3-1 on the season. The Mountaineers get a double overtime win over the Baylor Bears, as WVU is now 2-1 on the year. So think what you want from WVU. They get a win, and that, as Tom said, is the most important thing for the Mountaineers, because nothing is guaranteed at all. For James Santelli, pinch hitting for us for Pittsburgh Sports Now, for Tom Bragg over there at WV Sports Now, for all of us throughout the Now family of networks, and of course, Pittsburgh Sports Live. That does it for this college football edition, as we kind of combine things with the similar kickoffs of our post-game show this week. Keep sticking in with us throughout the Now family of networks. Make sure to subscribe to us here on PSL, as well as hit up all our family of Now network sites, and also check in next week as we will wrap up these games, wrap up the college football world. And until then, enjoy your pumpkin spices, enjoy the pumpkin patches, enjoy everything that the fall brings, because the fall season is in full effect, and that means college football upsets, and that happened today.